And before I get into the questions, I just wanted to tell you that I strongly encourage everybody to read Philippians, Colossians, and 1 Thessalonians for Wednesday night. It's a good possibility I won't be here, and Jim's going to be teaching class. So I want you all to be very impressed, that Jim will be very impressed with you all, answering all his questions. Okay, so read Philippians, Colossians, and 1 Thessalonians for next Wednesday. Okay, so we started in chapter 33, and chapter 34, and 35, and 36 is Elihu's speech. And chapter 33, he summarizes it, I think, by verse 12. He states, what about Job's right, about Job? I almost answered the question. Verse 12, Job isn't what? Right, he's not righteous. He's basically saying here in chapter 33. Elihu's conclusion, why man suffers, is to keep him from what in verse 30? Pride. I had the pit, the grave, hell. Yeah. Chapter 34, Elihu is still talking. His conclusion concerning Job is what in verse 35? Yeah. He's speaking without knowledge. His words are without wisdom. And 36, he answers like what? A wicked man. Okay. Chapter 35, Elihu is still talking. He comes down really hard on Job, claiming he is not righteous. Verse 12, Job cries to God, and God doesn't answer him because of what? His pride, right? Verse 13, because of what? And verse 16. Yeah, his mouth is in vain. Chapter 36, Elihu is still talking. Chapter 36 and 37, he basically is saying that God is mighty and just in his dealings with humans. God controls the weather. He created the earth. Verse 24 of chapter 37 states that God shows what to all? No partiality. Okay, and he's right on that part. Chapter 38, God talks to Job out of what? In other words, God's talking to Job on chapter 38. What is he talking to him out of? A whirlwind. Okay. God shows in chapter 38 just how Job has no idea of God's power and knowledge. Verse 4, God asked Job, where was he when what was laid? Yeah. God continues showing Job how little he knows about God. Who controls the weather? Verse 22 through 30. Yeah. Who made the constellations? Verse 31 through 33. God. Who takes care of the animals? Verse 39 through 41. God. Okay. Chapter 39, verses 13 through 18, goes back to what Job said in chapter 30, verse 9. How is Job like an ostrich here in verse 17? Chapter 39. Yeah. Well, he had no wisdom, no understanding. Verse 14, he lays his eggs on the ground. Verse 16, he treats his young harshly. This is an ostrich, of course, he's talking to. But that's how Job is similar to an ostrich, I guess, is what he's basically saying here. Verse 26 through 30, did Job have any say-so in designing the hawk, eagle, or vulture? Nope. I guess God's just saying to Job here, you don't know what you're talking about, basically, right? Right. Yeah. He created the earth. I mean, he did. He controls the weather. He made the constellations. And here's little Job. He's pretty much nothing. You know. He's like the ostrich, walking around with no wisdom. Chapter 40, verses 3 through 5. How did Job respond to God's words? Yeah. Yeah. In other words, I'm not even going to speak anymore. I'm so vile. Uh, so what are the two beasts God uses to show Job how small and helpless he is? Verse 15. Yeah. And verse 41:1 is the Leviathan. There's a lot of, I'm not going into that, but there's a lot of speculation what that was. If it was prehistoric or not. There's a lot of issues on different theories on what those two beasts were. Yeah, well, the behemoth, hippopotamus or elephant maybe, I don't know, but yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, we're not going into that today, but you know, there's some theories back behind all that. Yeah, yeah, just showing how little he is, basically. So chapter 42. What does Job do after God shows him how wrong he was concerning God in verse 6? Yes. And what does the Lord do to Job in verse 10?
All right. Oh, there it is. Yeah, it's on. It's on now. Yeah. Did anybody pick the homework up? I'm putting them out front, but I know you're not used to it yet. Does people need homework? Yeah. Marty, could you hand out these, and there's more in the back table back there if we need more. Huh? So the map, that was Wednesday. We did that map Wednesday. So the homework for today was to do the questions in Lesson 2. The homework that's being handed out now is the map work for Wednesday. And once again, in the back of the book, there are the exact maps I'm handed out, except they're fully filled out. They don't have the little white box over the top of them, and so it makes it really easy. You can just fill in the blank. You don't have to go and hunt for it. So let's see, what have I got in here? Oh, I got a pen in there. That's why that wouldn't turn it. Okay, so in your book, I'll also point out once again that there's this this little piece in there, this plastic thing that it's like a little folder, and you can stick your homework in there, or I'll be handing out some articles and stuff, some other material throughout the course of the series, and you can take that, put it in there for further reference. So, yeah, again, map work, and this is the Fertile Crescent or Mesopotamia that we're filling in the map work. And so, yeah, we're starting Lesson 2 today, and that will be page 7 in your books. Page 7. All right. And we're going to try and do all the questions today from Lesson 2. Pretty easy lesson. I think most everybody knows the basic outline of what happens, but some of the questions can take a little bit of work because it's some genealogy work and stuff like that. And I don't know about you, but I don't have the genealogies memorized or anything like that. So I got to go over there. I don't even know how to pronounce some of those names hardly. So, anyway, all right. The beginning is what we're looking at today. There was let's begin with a word of prayer before I get ahead of myself. John, would you lead us in prayer, please? Amen. Thank you. All right. So there was a chart in the book on Lesson 7, plot diagram. If you're familiar with the basic structure of most stories that are told, a plot structure is what refers to the structure of a story, how it's laid out. And there's really 5 parts, and I'll explain these terms. They're explained in the book. You have the exposition, which is the beginning, the introduction, the introductory material. There was once this thing that happened, and it sets up the rest of the story, or the in the beginning of the biblical story. And then that introduction sets up main characters or the main scene or the main story that's then talked about. And you have this rising action that leads up to a climax or some kind of problem that needs some kind of resolution. And then that climax happens, or some tragedy happens, or something happens in the story that everything leads up to. And then there's the falling action that results from that climax. And then there's the resolution, or the end of the story, kind of the wrapping up everything. And the Bible, if we look at the Bible as a story, as a narrative, it follows this pattern. There's all 5 of these in the biblical story, and we're going to be pointing out along the way the different sections of the Bible in light of this idea. So the exposition of the Bible then would be those great words, in the beginning, and then the things that follow that, all the way up to the main story. And the main story of the Bible begins with who? With who? Who does the main story of the Bible begin with? Just kind of jumping ahead, if you thought of it the way we're thinking about it. Well, the main story, what would, yeah, that's right. I asked the question wrong. So we'll get into the second question later on. That was confusing. I'm sorry. So, yes, the beginning. The very beginning of the exposition, the introduction. I was asking what came after the introduction, but basically the beginning of the biblical story spans 11 chapters of Genesis. That's the exposition. That's all of the material that sets up what is going to be the primary story of the Bible. So this is the setup. The first 11 chapters are covering an enormous amount of time in very few words. And then the Bible's going to, almost like narrowing your focus down to one thing. It starts out very broad, and then it narrows, and it narrows, and it narrows, and it narrows, and it narrows to one man and his family. And that's what we'll talk about next week, of course. So, did somebody have their hand up? Yeah. 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 Yes. 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 That's right. That's right. Hmm. Yes. I couldn't have said it better. That's perfect. Yes, absolutely. So, yeah, what Michael said. I'm not going to try to repeat it back because it was good and very articulate, and so I would just mess it up if I tried to repeat it. So, in the beginning, there are 4 stories that really span the beginning. And as you sort of talked about, they might all have their own plot structure to them. But Genesis 1 begins. Someone want to read Genesis 1 in verses 1 through 3. Genesis 1 verses 1 through 3. There you go. And so from that point on, God creates everything, and you talked about it in your prayer, by use of what? His Word. His Word. He spoke everything into existence. How many days did He do that? 6 days, and then He rested on the 7th day. We'll get more at one of the questions was about what He created on those days. So we'll just leave that there. But Genesis 1 and 2 are about the creation. Now, Genesis 1 is kind of the overview, and then Genesis 2 fits inside Genesis 1. And in particular, Genesis 2 is mainly about the 6th day, where God creates man and He creates woman. And so chapter 2 is about specifically God bringing forth man out of the dust of the ground and breathing into his nostrils the breath of life, and then setting him in a beautiful garden, but then looking at him alone and realizing he's alone. He needs a helper. And so that's when He makes woman. Now, at some point in the story, while they're in the garden, of course, the serpent comes to Eve and he tempts her. And what was the command that God gave Adam and Eve? There was one command. There was one prohibition. not to eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And so the serpent comes in Genesis 3, and someone read verses 1 through 6. Yeah. And so what was the result of all of that? Sin. And what's the result of sin? Death. Now, Romans 5:12 says, "Therefore, just as through one man sin entered into the world, and death through sin, and thus death spread to all men, because all sinned." So that really was it's a big point in the beginning of the story. And then it just spirals from there, really, doesn't it? In chapter 4, we have the first crime. And what was that? Murder. And who killed who? Cain killed his brother Abel. Why did he do that? Jealousy. Yeah. We'll talk more about that in just a little bit. But Genesis 3, we also have another murder. And I think that's one of the questions. So we'll talk about that later. But all of that just spirals down until we get to a man named Noah. And in Noah's days, the earth was so corrupt with sin. It had just devolved into such chaos and sin and evil that God said he was going to completely destroy man except for Noah and those who were with him on the ark. Now, somebody want to read Genesis 6 and verses, read verses 1 through 8 again. Read verses 1 through 8, Genesis chapter 6. There you go. And so what did God command Noah to do? Build an ark. And all the animals would come into that ark, 2 of every kind, and 2 by 2, and they would go into the ark and they'd be kept alive. And God destroyed the world with a flood. But did that fix the problem of sin? No, it didn't. What does Noah do when he gets off the boat? Huh? He gets drunk. And then something really weird happens with his son. And then there's a curse, and we'll talk about that's one of the questions. And the cycle of sin just starts all over again, doesn't it? It just starts all over. Because we haven't dealt with the problem of sin fully yet. And so, and that's, like Michael said, that's the climax of the biblical story. That's where everything's headed, how God is going to fix this problem of sin, how he's going to remedy it and provide atonement. But as man spirals down once again after the flood, it leads to another huge rebellion, and it's a very interesting little story. And we're going to read a little bit of it. But in Genesis 11, 1 through 4, as people were multiplying on the earth, they came together to do something, and God did not like it. Genesis 11, 1 through 4. Somebody read that. All right, good. So what does God do to stop that? He confuses their speech, and they just separate. They just divide and scatter all throughout the world. Now, after Genesis chapter 11 and that, and that particular story, once again, this is a long period of time being covered in a very short amount of time, in a short amount of material. And one of the ways that the Bible covers a long period of time with very few words is with genealogies. Genealogies. One of the functions of genealogies is storytelling. It's a way of summing up a great period of time, and Genesis does that. Genesis 1 through 11 does that in two places. Where are the two? Well, there's actually two genealogies that kind of run side by side in which two chapters? So there's 10 and 11. Those kind of run side by side. There's another pair, though, that I was thinking about. That was good with Genesis 10 and 11. Those run side by side, too. But there's another set. And that's in Genesis 4 and 5, where you have Cain's descendants and then Seth's descendants, and they run side by side. And then you have Genesis 10 and 11, and those run side by side. But 10, we're not going to talk about 10 much, but 10 is really fascinating. 10 is what many people call the Table of Nations, and it charts the different peoples that came from the three sons of Noah that got off the boat. And then Genesis 11 is taking just one of those lines and running it to one specific person. So Genesis 4 and 5 and Genesis 10 and 11 are two places where we find these genealogies running together, and that summarizes this period of time between the creation and the flood. And it kind of tells you sort of where a lot of people came from, especially Genesis 10, if you read about that table of nations. But in particular, the genealogy in Genesis 11, the main purpose of that genealogy is to give the descendants of Shem all the way to one particular man that the rest of the Bible story is going to be about him and his family. And it's through that man and his family that God's going to render or remedy the problem of sin. So that's Genesis 1 through 11. And let's go ahead and instead of summarizing it more and kind of crossing over into the questions, let's go ahead and answer the questions, and that will kind of fill in the blanks of some of the things we haven't talked about. So I think the first question we've already answered. What part of Genesis could be considered the exposition of the biblical story? And of course that we've talked about the major events that take place in that. So in the first part of that, on creation, what did God make on each day of creation? Okay, day 1, light, the separation of dark and light. Good. Mm-hmm. Yes. Yep. What about day 3? Right. So notice he's not just creating stuff. He's creating and then separating. That's part of how God's not just creating, he's organizing the world in which he made into a particular order. So he's giving it order and speaking stuff into existence. What about day 4? So, yeah. So he already created day and night, right? And he created light and then separated day from the night in the first day. But on the 4th day, he is now giving natural order to that. So he's given a natural body to carry on that light and ruling the light and the darkness. Day 5, what does he make? Right. Sea creatures for the deep, birds of the sky. What about day 6? He made all the animals and man, all the beasts, all the land beasts. And then what did he create on the 7th day? He rested. Hey, I like that answer, Sam. He created the 7th day. That is a really good answer. I've never heard anybody put it that way. That is really good. Yeah, but that is the kind of the point with Moses and the Sabbath day, that he blessed the 7th day. What he's doing is he's not only creating the stuff, and he's not only giving order to that, but he's actually laying out how to account for time. He's also doing that by doing it on those days and then putting in the main way that people have always accounted for time before we had watches and stuff was the sun, the moon, and the stars. In fact, God puts that up there and says, this is how you're going to keep time. This is how you're going to know the days, the months, the seasons, the years. It's all you got to do is look up there and you'll know. You'll know. And then, of course, we've invented ways of kind of keeping track of that mechanically apart from the natural order, but still, that's what God did. It's pretty neat. How did man first sin? By falling into temptation. What was that temptation? Not to eat of that tree of knowledge of good and evil. Was it just the fruit that looked good? Fruit did look good, didn't it? But what was the root of it, though? Right. The wisdom it gave was enticing. So it all goes back to that ever-present sin that wants to pop up in everybody. I mean, we've all got our own thing, but there's one sin that's prevalent among all people, and that's pride. That's pride, that wanting to do our own thing, wanting to take and define good and evil for ourselves. Who committed the first murder and why? Cain, because he was jealous? Does anybody else have a different why or a different way of putting the why? Right. He didn't bring God the best of his fruits. Yes. Yes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it all started with him. It all started with him deciding to do what he wanted. Yeah. Good. Good. What early inventions or aspect of culture are mentioned in Genesis 4? Okay, offering of sacrifices, good. Yep. Musical instruments, tent making, very good. Farming, taking care of animals. Yeah, smithing. Yeah, they learned very soon. They learned that you could that you could extract metals out of the earth, melt them down, and make them into things. And man was inventing all of these things in Genesis chapter 4. That's not exactly the view of history that we're taught, is it? Man crawled out of a cave and the only thing he had was these stone tools. Like, he was very sophisticated right off the bat. People were inventing things and well, it could be. Could be, yeah. Yeah. So there begins all these different things. I skipped one of the questions. Who built the first known city? This kind of goes with the other one. Cain. Yeah. And that's kind of part of the culture, right? Because you don't just have, it starts with one family, but how everything's going to unfold is that those families are going to set up in different locations, and then there's going to be cities. And a city, in a definitional sense, is really a concentration of culture and technology into one location. And so that's what a city is. And of course, along with all the people, because the people are what bring the culture and all the inventions and such. All right. What did Cain's descendant Lamech do? He killed a man. Why did he kill a man? He wounded him. He wounded him. He said, if Cain be avenged sevenfold, I think it was, then I'll be avenged 70-fold. Yes. Yes, it is. Yep, it is. Because he took more than one wife. And that's just going to explode, isn't it? That's just going to completely explode. And then the flood isn't going to do away with that idea either, because that's just going to pick up once again. And even God's people, even if his most beloved people take part in that, how does that work out? Cause a lot of problems, doesn't it? Especially with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Those first few, or Isaac, it would be Abraham and Jacob. Causes some problems there. All right. What were the names of Noah's? Oh, I'm sorry. I'm going to skip a big question here. Yeah. Yeah. All right. What was the names of Adam's son who replaced Abel's seed? Seth. List the names of the genealogy of Genesis 5 who were his descendants. So the first one was Enosh, then Canaan, then Mahalalel, then Jared, then Enoch, then Methuselah, then Lamech. Different Lamech, right? Because the other Lamech is Cain's descendant, right? They're running right alongside. So Enoch is different too, yes. That's what they named the city after. This is a different Enoch. What about this Enoch? What do we know about him? God took him. Yeah. All right. And so Lamech's son was Noah, right? And of course, Noah's sons are who? Yeah, Sem, Ham, and Japheth. All right. Who was Canaan? This is very important in the biblical story, by the way. Who was Canaan? And what was his curse? That's Cain. This is Canaan. He was to serve the other son. That's right. So who is Canaan? He was Ham's son. Right. And he was to serve who? His brothers, but mainly who? Shem. It was Shem. That's right. Now, this is very important in the biblical story. This is what's so cool about this particular point of the story. It was sometimes skip right over it. It's very strange. But Canaan is cursed to serve Shem. This is a prophecy, by the way. Now, think about it. Who are Canaan's descendants? The Canaanites. How do they serve Shem? They serve, because who's going to come in and possess the land? The Israelites. Now, who are the Israelites from? Descendants of Shem. That's it. So this is a prophecy here. Already, God is talking about what's going to happen between Shem's descendants, the Israelites, and Canaan's descendants, the Canaanites. That the Canaanites are going to be subservient to the Shemites. All right, good. What did the people of the earth decide to build in Genesis 11, and why did they build it? They built a great tower to reach heaven. Why did they build it? To make a name for themselves. That's exactly right. Which goes back to what sin in particular, once again? Pride. We're going to build this great thing and we're going to make a name for ourselves. We're going to talk more about the phenomena of towers Wednesday night and how they appear all over the earth. Ancient towers, how they appear all over the earth and in different cultures. Yeah, John? Yes. There's something like that in there. I'm not sure. I personally am not. There's kind of an interesting idea in there. Maybe it was something about worship or getting to heaven or, yeah, something in that realm. It's kind of interesting. It is. It's really interesting. Yeah. Maybe we can talk more about that on Wednesday because we are going to talk more about the Tower of Babel. I've always called it Babel, but then I've heard it called Babel. So it eventually becomes, that place becomes known as Babylon. Yeah. All right. Last question. List the name of Shem's descendants in the genealogy of Genesis 11. Okay. Arphaxad, Selah, Eber, Peleg. Now, why Peleg? He's highlighted. Why is he named Peleg? What happened in his days? There's a little, but this is storytelling. This is a storytelling device. So there's a little place where he drops what's going on in the biblical story in there. It says, in his days something happened. The earth was divided in his days. All right. And that is specifically verse let's see. We got maybe I got the wrong one. Maybe I got the wrong one that the earth was, let's see. Got Eber, Sarah lived long, he begot Peleg. Okay, that's actually not in this one. Yeah, it happens at the Tower of Babel, but I think the part about Peleg is actually in Genesis 10, not in 11. I'm getting my chapters mixed up. But I do think it's somewhere in Genesis 10. Is it? Yeah. Eber born two sons, named one was Peleg, for in his days the earth was divided. And I think my footnote on verse 25 is going to say, yes, his name means divide. It means division. So you have Peleg. So you have just a few people down in the descendants of Shem, and people have already multiplied to the point that the earth is now divided. Then after him was who? Reu, then Serug, then Nahor, then Terah, then Abram. Then Abram. And that is the beginning of the primary biblical story. So there's the exposition, and the exposition sets up the story of Abraham and the patriarchs and the Israelite nation. So we'll talk more about that, but do the map, and then Wednesday night we'll come talk more about the map and